Shweta asked me to read certain portions of the book. She wanted me to read the prologue. I'll do a bit of that, and then a small portion inside the book as well. So in a leafy Mumbai suburb, on the very turn of a U-bend, stood the handsome structure of Paradise Towers, a residential building built in the late 60s as the last word in modern convenience. By modern, the builders meant that it had an elevator with a designated liftman and a garden that most bungalows would be envious of with its designated gardener. Over the years, other more modern and loftier structures came up in the area, dwarfing Paradise Towers. However, none could compete with its clean lines, meticulous planning, which kept it from flooding during the rains or its residents. The building stood a few meters from the beach, and depending on the time of day, it enjoyed either a balmy breeze or the stench of drying fish. The road it stood on was more a bylane that rarely saw any traffic besides the random vegetable vendor and fisherwoman who, with their baskets on their head, crossed over to their fishing village via the building twice a day. The facade of the building was vanilla white and got a new coat of paint every 5 years. On it was painted in bold brick red letters, Paradise Towers, vertically, with the S in the towers dangling just above the balcony on the first floor. That was another one of its unique features, whereas the buildings around Paradise Towers were painted steel grey. Their windows tinted black. Paradise Towers boasted a substantial balcony for every road-facing flat. It was a building law that the occupants were not allowed to hang their drawing on the balcony. So as the years went on, it retained its aesthetic appeal, while the places around it got cluttered and messy. The entrance was a wrought iron gate with arrowhead bars secured by a sickle lock mechanism. A smaller pedestrian gate was attached to it and was most often used by visitors and residents alike. A metal-sheeted guard's cabin stood outside the gate, though its inhabitant preferred to sit outside it on a folding chair, his register and desk fan jostling for space on a rickety stool in front of him. A wide concrete driveway led to the ground floor, where in the maze of pillars that defined the parking spots stood the elevator. A staircase, right by the lift, wound its way up the building, every even-numbered set of stairs being followed by a landing. The elevator was placed so that it divided every floor in two, with a flat on each side and a small lobby in front of it. The staircase also allowed access to each floor, and the substantial terrace, accessible to and all used by everyone for the drying of clothes, housing of water tanks, and the electrical room, and where all the staff gathered to moan about salaries and to gossip. Rarely in the spring, the building children would go up there to fly kites, but as the years wore on, the more modern modes of play were invented, the children lost interest. The flats were spacious and airy with large windows that let in the sunlight. They each had a small kitchen, staff quarter adjacent to it, and 2 bedrooms. The garden downstairs was lush and lined with bougainvillea creepers on the boundary wall, which spilled onto the road, shedding petals and carpeting the street pink. Well-tended flower beds with seasonal flowers ran all over the circumference of the garden, breaking only at its entrance, and a mud path ran alongside for those who wanted to walk. Palm trees flanked the driveway on one side, and there were talks of installing a water fountain, which was then scrapped in favor of leaving the driveway with a roundabout used for potted plants and a seating spot for the maids to keep an eye on their wards, who often played in the garden. The residents of Paradise Towers were an amenable bunch. They all interacted with each other, and the children were constantly in and out of one another's flats. The women had a committee which organized Diwali and Christmas parties yearly, and once even a 70th birthday party. They were fast friends and sworn enemies, but seldom any grave unpleasantness. Nothing dramatic ever happened at Paradise Towers, or so you might think. Of course, appearances can be very deceptive. So that was the prologue to the book, and there's a little small chapter on one of the elements that stayed in Paradise Pass. So Dinesh's vacant spot in the car park was soon occupied by a bicycle superfluously trilling its bell as Mr. Roy, his mop of wiry black hair ruffled by the wind and thick black square-framed spectacles balanced on the tip of his nose that he peered over, swerved into place. Dismounting his cycle with some difficulty, seeing as he had weighed under his arm a briefcase, Mr. Roy parked his ride, smoothed his clothes and hair by running a hand over them, pushed his spectacles back up his nose, and proceeded to remove something wrapped in layers of newspaper from the basket attached to the front of his cycle. From the shadows, a middle-aged man came forward and relieved Mr. Roy of his briefcase, leaving the gentleman to better hold his newspaper-wrapped parcel. Though the Roys had a car, Mr. Roy preferred to use his bicycle on trips to the fish market, or so he told his friends. The truth, however, was that he had once driven himself into the gutter right outside the building. A nostalgic song on the radio had set him off daydreaming, causing him to lose control of his car. The car and Mr. Roy were extricated from the gutter with great difficulty. One of the Kapoor children had even captured the entire episode on their phone. The car, though, sent for an overhaul, would always smell of rotting bananas every time the engine overheated. Mrs. Roy had ever since forbidden her husband from driving the car when he was on his own, and so Mr. Roy had resorted to using his bicycle for most errands. Mr. Roy rung for the elevator that whirred and hummed as it descended, the liftman smiling his broad smile as he came into view. The grille of the elevator drawn open, the liftman greeted his passenger, who once ensconced in the lift became the subject of his over-familiar repartee. "Fresh fish for dinner today, Sabji," he asked, eyeing the parcel that Mr. Roy was now cradling in his arms. Mr. Roy gave him a perfunctory smile that should have indicated to the liftman that he found his questioning impertinent, but in this case managed only to encourage him. "When I was in my village in Bihar," the liftman prattled on, "we knew many Bengali families. Nothing like homemade macher jol, Sabji. It had been an age since I have had the pleasure of eating such delicately prepared fish." Mr. Roy leaned forward, pressing the button to his floor, which in his enthusiasm the liftman had forgotten to push, and the elevator began its labored climb to the second floor, where Mrs. Roy would be waiting to receive the fish that only her husband was trusted to select from the mongers, in lieu of which he would leave office early, using a made-up physiotherapy appointment as his excuse. With a click and a jump, the elevator came to a halt on the fourth floor, where the middle-aged manservant, now divested of the briefcase, was waiting to open the elevator door and let his boss out. The minute he stepped onto the landing of the fourth floor, Mr. Roy's superior olfactory senses picked up the most divine aroma. Tilting his head backwards and flaring his nostrils, Mr. Roy shut his eyes, gave himself up entirely to the scent. He followed it as if in a trance, only to find his reverie broken when his nose smashed against the door of not his mighty establishment, but that of his neighbors, the Patels. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit Uncle. Thank you for doing the honors, and thank you for reading that absolutely wonderful two passages actually from the book. Congratulations, Shweta. It truly reads so well, but that also has something to do with your illustrious father. I'm going to actually now turn the spotlight on Shweta and actually get her to do some talking about her journey, how it all happened. And for that, I would like to invite critic, a filmmaker, and an author himself, the very prolific Raja Sen.